The Lost Princess, Chapter 3, David's senses trickled back to him, slowly, but quite surely. His vision returned first, followed by the sensation of touch. His head quaked with a splitting pain, like the blade of an axe being driven into a waiting log. He grimaced as his surroundings slowly became more clear. Not again, he was drenched with sweat. Wetness and ickiness covered every inch of his body. He went to wipe his forehead, but for some reason, he simply couldn't. He was utterly and totally incapable of moving his arm. Odd. With a concerted grunt, he managed to lift his head, revealing his present predicament. A web of thick, unyielding ropes crisscrossed his body, firmly binding him to a wooden surface elevated off the floor. An incredible thirst suddenly overcame him. David hadn't consumed so much as a drop of water since the battle. He needed water now. Calm down, David blinked. He drew a breath in and let one out. In and out. How had he wound up here? The dart, of course. At the crash site. His alien attacker must have picked him up and dragged him here, but where was here? Though thoroughly restrained, he attempted to scan his surroundings, in a fashion that can be best likened to the manner by which a submarine scope pores over enemy waters. He was presently detained in a structure of some kind, obviously not one of natural origin. Opposite to his feet was a stairway that only led upwards. This, combined with the room's dampness, indicated that he was somewhere underground, perhaps in a cellar or basement of some kind. The place looked meager. There was no electrical lighting, only a plain candle that flickered quietly atop a stand near the stairway. Feeble wooden planks comprised the walls, the ceiling, and the floor. Dusty wooden furniture stood stacked against the wall. Perhaps the civilization that inhabited this world was less advanced than GAIA had predicted. GAIA, his earpiece was missing. Had his captors taken it? No time to think. The floorboard above him buckled as footsteps traveled across the ceiling. Dust came loose and streamed down from the crevasses between the planks. The footsteps stopped for a brief moment before traveling in another direction. David listened and watched with bated breath. A creaking sound came from the stairwell, followed by a slam. A gust of air washed over David. He squirmed in the bindings. A green, scaly, humanoid leg appeared, followed by a wary face. Its eyes went wide and a gasp escaped from its throat. The two locked eyes, and the trespasser stood deathly still. After a moment of absolute silence, the figure quickly fled back upstairs. Now David was more curious than terrified. He had only caught a strained glimpse of the creature, but it didn't appear especially intimidating. If anything, it appeared more frightened than he was. 2 legs, 2 arms, an expressive face. Perhaps communication with this race wouldn't be as difficult as he once imagined, but for now, he was still a prisoner, and he was still tied to the table hidden in a basement under a dilapidated cabin of some kind. He listened closely and watched the ceiling. Footsteps traveled back and forth and every which way across the floor above. There was a clattering sound followed by some muffled shouts. Perhaps there was not one, but instead several captors. He squirmed again, albeit more methodically this time. Some progress. The commotion taking place on the floor above suddenly stopped. There was another creaking sound, followed by another slam. David froze and returned his attention to the stairwell. He waited. Another pair of green, scaly legs stepped down the stairs, these ones slightly darker, followed by the rest of the figure. It was difficult to make out any fine details in the darkness. The figure stepped into the candlelight. It was of moderate height and seemingly feminine form. It lacked skin, instead possessing hard, green scales that covered every inch of its body. It wore only a loincloth and what could best be described as a bra, both comprised of simple string and beads. For now, at least for his purposes, the notion that the being belonged to the female sex seemed a safe bet. Her legs were quite long, encompassing about half of her height, and crimson-singed frills wriggled about on either side of her face. David dared not speak. It was then that he noticed her impressive musculature, sizable biceps, and chiseled thighs. He supposed he could handle her in a fight. But he'd much rather not, certainly in his present pitiful state. Perhaps the females were the warriors of this species. She moved closer to him. His eyes tracked her as she slowly circled the table. Did she intend to interrogate him? Words. Or, at least, sounds that flowed like words. Hgamenuk inchin mi stuvafa ha. Estavafa. He had no clue as to what that meant. It wasn't common and it certainly wasn't English. Her accent was sharp, not unlike that of that Danish corporal he occasionally had the pleasure of dining with back on the Abacus. Perhaps GAIA could recognize this language and construct a translator of some kind, but such a luxury was currently an impossibility. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I have no clue as to what you're saying," he said aloud. Confusion crossed her face. She paused before unleashing another barrage of incomprehensible words. How could he make this work? His eyes went to his hands. Gestures? Quite rudimentary, but for now, it would simply have to suffice. Now, as to how he could emote while tied to a table. He made his hands flat and lifted them as far as he could, signaling stop. It took a moment, but the alien woman recognized the gesture and stopped speaking. All right. He had her attention. What now? He thought for a second. This was going to be weirder than he anticipated. Clarification would be nice, but right now he needed water. He curled his hand so it looked as though he were holding an invisible cup. In unison, he puckered his lips and made a slurping sound as he tilted the invisible cup towards him. This was embarrassing, but the woman watched carefully. He repeated the gesture a few times. A brief flicker of realization crossed the alien's eye. She cautiously backed away from the table and retreated up the stairs. She returned just minutes later with a cup placed atop a ceramic platter. The platter itself was surprisingly ornate, especially considering their primitive dress and the state of their present whereabouts. She lifted the cup off the platter and lowered it to his mouth. He opened his mouth and drank from the cup. He nearly choked and began coughing, prompting her to quickly back away. It trickled down his cheek and spilled all over. The water, it felt so good. He needed more. He rapidly shook his head. The woman obliged. He quickly consumed the rest of the water and tilted his head back, finally, content. Perhaps this arrangement could work out after all, 20,000 light-years away. A man removed his coat and his hat and placed the items on their appropriate hanger in his locker. He stopped and warmly greeted the secretary before handing her a box of seasonal delicacies, cookies, chocolate muffins, and neatly wrapped capsules of delectable vanilla flavoring imported straight from the equator of Eden. He strode leisurely through the passages and hallways of the buildings. He was a good man, and a loving one. His demeanor was always quite pleasant and he was always armed with a joke. 10 years ago, such a disposition would be viewed as terribly corny. But in these trying times where morale was constantly in flux, every ounce of levity contributed a great deal to the inhabitants of this bleak building. A grieving widow, a worried mother, a guilty brother, a despairing father. Men and women who struggled to sit and watch while their loved ones fought the war they never could. Sometimes they needed to know that they were appreciated and that they mattered, so that's exactly what he did. After his typical stroll around the workplace, he finally settled in at his office. He swiveled around to face the window, sipping a steaming coffee. A bright, white landscape greeted him. Snowflakes lazily fluttered to the ground. It was awfully cold in Virginia this time of year. He spun around to face his holographic terminal, warmed his hands, and got to work. Immediately, a notification appeared in the bottom corner of the holographic space. Case redirect to Analyst Daniel Vargas. Note, you'd better check this out, Trinity A. He swiped at the notification and the case filled the workspace. A squadron commander was missing, lost sometime during the Battle of Viranium. He hadn't been killed in action, nor had he been captured by the Federation. His ship was destroyed sometime after the battle. He pulled up the flight log and read his last location. His eyes widened. He read it again and again and again, almost as though the letters would change, but they didn't. Daniel couldn't help but mutter a phrase that the sunny, well-humored man hadn't uttered in some time. You've gotta be fucking kidding me. The Lost Princess, Chapter 4. Outside the fragile walls of their poor shanty, Princess Ryla and Lien waited with impatience. Ryla paced up and down the trail with frustration while Lien sat atop the stump of a tree, her arms close to her chest and her frills a harmatetum yellow. It was early in the morning and the sun had not yet climbed over the rim of the dead res, casting their decrepit homestead, as well as most of the valley, in a chilly shadow. What can possibly be going on down there? Lien asked, quite absently. Katerna. She was the one engaging in contact with the alien. Ryla glowered at the very thought. Her aide had become quite obstinate and cross during her time at the palace, and her disposition had only soured further during the course of their exile. What gave her the right to engage in initial relations with the alien? She preened her frills. Perhaps she was being too harsh on the woman. After all, Katerna had aided in her escape from the capital. She played a critical part in ensuring that Ryla remained free from the vicious clutches of the usurper and his tendrils that stretched across the kingdom. It would have been quite easy for her to submit to the new government and bring the young Princess Ryla to his toes. But she held firm and loyal to the princess, even if it sometimes hurt. Obstinance is quite a fickle thing. On cue, Katerna emerged from the hut. Her shoulders remained high, but her eyes seemed heavy. She was in a contemplative mood, like Ryla. Quite a bit was running through her head as well. Lien perked up and watched Katerna eagerly. So. Katerna leaned against one of the posts supporting the porch. I don't know. She stood up and began pacing about the trail. Every step was deliberate, every movement meaningful. Firstly, she announced. I believe the alien to be of the male persuasion. Because the species that he belongs to quite closely resembles our own, I believe our own categories of sex can be accurately applied to his being. He does not appear to possess breasts, nor other reproductive organs, consistent with our sex. Lien's eyes went wide. You saw him. She paused dramatically. Her voice became quiet. Exposed? Ryla's frills burned crimson at the thought. She wanted this conversation to end. Katerna's eyes narrowed. She responded coldly, Do you picture me a regular harlot, Lien? The aide shook her head rapidly. Katerna drew in a sharp breath. Seemingly unaffected, she continued sharing her findings. I also do not believe our guest to be born of any of the worlds that comprise our great kingdom of Ravinia. She said. He does not speak a lick of the king's tongue. Though there may be a remote possibility that he emerged from a planet within our borders, the notion that such an advanced civilization, do recall that he arrived here by way of interstellar travel, has existed and developed for thousands of years while completely avoiding our detection is dubious, to say the least. That being said, I also do not believe our captive to be playing the part of a present and imminent threat to the livelihood of our ongoing operation. Katerna concluded. This creature appears to be just as bewildered of us as we are of him. However, this is not to say that this alien does not have the capacity to pose a threat at some point in the not-too-distant future. It was Lien's turn to speak. So, what do you intend to do? Katerna thought for a moment. Quite frankly, the doings of this creature are not, and should not, be our chief concern. Her eyes flicked to the princess. Our chief concern being, of course, the continued independence of Princess Ryla. Still, I cannot, in good conscience, simply dump the alien out into the wilderness in his present state. In 7 days, once his condition has improved, I will render him unconscious once more through the use of the same toxin that the alien succumbed to last night. She said. Her eyes now went to Lien. Lien and I will then transport him to the site of the crash and leave him there. Until then, we only have the matter of providing him with water and seeing what foodstuffs his body will accept. We will not share this incident with the residents or Darnan, lest we attract any more attention than we already have. There was a prolonged silence. Sounds like a plan, if I do say so myself. Lien smirked. She turned to Ryla. What do you think, princess? Ryla was deep in thought. Katerna's plan sounded logical and quite airtight, but something else nagged at Ryla, something she couldn't quite make sense of. The most unnatural compulsion had come over her, something she did not fully understand, but simultaneously an urge that she found impossible to ignore. She needed more information from this alien and wanted to nurse him back to health, properly. Have you closely examined the wound our captive sustained during the crash? She suddenly blurted out, only a cursory examination. But the wound does not appear to be totally debilitating or a threat to his continued livelihood. Katerna answered, her frills wriggling. Why does the princess ask? Ryla stiffened. You know my educational endeavors to be quite extensive. I spent 2 years under the tutorship of Mar de Gal, a widely renowned medical professional, with unique knowledge in the anatomy and care of alien species. He imparted upon me a good deal of this information, which I would like to apply to our detainee. No. Katerna said authoritatively, her arms crossed. But why? It was foolish of me to bring this alien into our home. I have already placed you in incredible danger. Katerna said. Gods, princess, why is it I that is more concerned with your well-being than yourself? Princess Ryla's mouth opened to speak, but she simply could not find the proper words. She tried again, furious. Do you not see your own hypocrisy? You dragged that man into our abode. As far as I'm concerned, he is our responsibility. Katerna stepped closer. You will not, under any circumstances, administer aid to this alien in an unauthorized manner. Do you understand? She remained silent. Her aide stepped even closer. Answer me, princess. Do you understand? Yes. Ryla said at last. Her eyes went to the ground. It is settled then. Katerna said. We will carry on with our typical business. Lien, I believe you ought to charge the light bow. Another restless night for Ryla, then. Over the course of day, thoughts of the creature came to dominate her every thought. He became her obsession. She spent the day secretly collecting supplies: a bucket, a roll of cloth, a bottle of astringent, a needle and string. During her daily walk she collected an adequate supply of marhala leaves which, when ground into a fine powder and mixed thoroughly with water, formed a healing solution that increased scale regeneration tenfold. She even lubricated the hinges to the cellar door so that her aides would not hear that horrid creaking sound. Was her medical arsenal crude? Absolutely, an unbelievable step down from the state-of-the-art medical facilities of the capital. But such instruments and procedures were so far out of the question that she barely considered them. For all intents and purposes, in these backwater woods, such technology did not and could not exist. She waited until Katerna and Lien had fully settled into bed, typically an hour after she made her move only when she was sure they were fast asleep. She quietly collected the articles and lightly approached the cellar door. She lifted the door and silently closed it behind her. There he was. For a moment Ryla was frozen. Her throat tightened and her frills turned crimson. The creature was awake. Its eyes followed her every movement, every twitch. Its eyes were warm and solid, but hidden behind them was something deeply primal, a most civilized predator. He had a sandy complexion, and the black fur atop his head was oily and tousled. She collected her bearings and continued her approach. She felt oddly nude around him. The baggy fabric that covered his legs and the thin, clothy shirt that shielded most of his chest made her ceremonial bra and beaded loincloth feel quite revealing in comparison. She was awed by the sheer size of the creature. Standing erect, she calculated he would stand a full head and shoulders above her, taller than even the largest Ravinian she had seen. She made note of the large muscles under its thick, tough hide. She could even make out traces of muscles that protected its chest, obscured only partially the thin cloth garment. The man was a soldier, no doubt, and an exceptional specimen at that. If he wanted to escape his present enclosure, she could see no way that she or her aides could stop him. Then it hit her, the smell. It was terrible and pungent at first, but within moments became quite intoxicating. An odor raw and distinctly animal. It was no wonder why Katerna exited the cellar in such a stupor earlier. How could one not be so utterly entranced? Ryla nearly slapped herself across the face then and there. She came down here with a mission, and she intended to complete it. She set the bucket on the floor and placed the rest of the items on the table. The alien first appeared confused, but upon seeing the supplies more clearly became oddly at ease. Perhaps such primitive medical treatment was not uncommon where he came from. He shifted under the web of ropes, jolting Ryla slightly. She lowered herself to his level and examined the wound. It was rough. A large gash, roughly the length of her forearm, which was quite undersized, even for Ravinian proportions, along the side of his abdomen. The clothing he wore was dampened red with blood in that area. The first object was to lift this region of his abdominal clothing so that there would be no interference. Carefully and precisely, she peeled this portion of his clothing away from his skin. Blood from the wound had essentially glued the shirt to the site of the injury. His chest suddenly heaved and he drew in a sharp breath. She immediately retracted her hands. "I'm sorry," she exclaimed, but he didn't understand a thing she said. His eyes drifted to his wound and went back to hers. He nodded. Hopefully that was a good thing. She lifted the affected area of the shirt completely, revealing the wound in its entirety. The wound was caked with days-old blood. The bleeding appeared to have stopped, although there was likely still some amount of internal bleeding. The area around the wound was a dull purple. She laid a delicate finger on the skin and briefly wondered what incredible force would be required to puncture him to this degree. It was only when she grabbed her washcloth that she realized how wet the creature was. Liquid oozed from every pore of its skin. No species, intelligent or otherwise, exhibited such behavior, and she quietly speculated as to its purpose. She placed the wet cloth on his wound and applied pressure. Its muscles tightened before slowly beginning to relax. She wet the area twice more before applying astringent. He tensed again, a seething sound briefly escaped its throat. Next was the healing solution. There was no apparent effect, at least not immediately, but that was to be expected. Results would likely not become apparent for a day or even longer. Now to dress the wound. Ryla wasn't sure as to how she should go about doing this. She decided a bandage that wrapped around the circumference of his abdomen would be best. But the only way to apply such a bandage would be releasing his upper half from the bindings. She swallowed soberly. She looked to the creature's face. "Can I trust you?" Another confused look. Hopefully that was a good thing. Slowly and crudely, she managed to loosen the ropes. She removed one section, and then another. She could very well be a poor judge of this man's facial expressions, but she believed he looked rather grateful. She made a motion with her hands, indicating that he should sit up. He seemed to deliberate for a moment before doing as she asked. Sufficiently pleased, Ryla took the roll of cloth and began wrapping it around his chest. She felt his eyes on her the whole while gears were turning in that alien mind of his, and how desperately she wished to know which thoughts dominated. But she suppressed those feelings and instead focused on bandaging the man. 3 layers ought to do it. That was all the cloth she had managed to scrounge up, so for now it would simply have to make do. Their eyes locked. Ryla found herself frozen again. A billion thoughts rushed through her mind, indecipherable and scatterbrained, but quite plainly present. Oh, how she wished to, bam! The cellar door slammed open and shut. 4 angry feet made their way down the stairs. Katerna and Lien. How had they known? Ryla turned to face them, the flames of defiance burning brightly in her eyes. "Ryla!" Katerna roared, candlelight in hand, this time dropping the princess title completely. She opened her mouth to speak when she noticed the alien sitting up on the dining table, looking bewildered as ever. Her attention returned to Ryla. "Come here this instant." "We have no idea. I helped him, Katerna, because you wouldn't." "Do not lie to me, princess," Katerna said bitterly. "I know full well why you're really down here." "Gods, I should have known. A young woman of your age." A rumbling, from where, Ryla could not determine. All those inside the dark cellar fell silent, listening carefully. What could that be? Lien asked quietly. "Another." The thin walls of the cellar suddenly began to shake with increasing fervor. The sounds of atomic engines roared outside, disturbing their shanty to its very foundation. Not 1, not 2, not 3, it seemed there were nearly a dozen. Lien turned to Katerna, who turned to Ryla. "Princess!" she shouted, her demeanor suddenly changed. "Stay down here while I investigate this fracas. Lien, you come with me." And with that, Ryla's aides disappeared as quickly as they arrived. They closed the cellar door behind, leaving a frightened Ryla and baffled alien alone in the flickering candlelight. The Lost Princess, Chapter 5, The Abigail, a portable atomic fusion engine. The original iteration of the device, long since lost to the winds of time, was first tested approximately 12,000 years ago. While the fundaments of such a machine had been employed by certain sects of Ravinian civilization on an industrial scale, it wasn't until the Abigail that such tech became available to the populace at large. Gone were the days of electric vehicles and chemical propulsion, replaced instead with free, unlimited energy. The possibilities seemed endless, and they quite nearly were. Now, not even the stars were the limit. Learned historians might go so far as to argue that the development provided the impetus for the first Ravinian age of expansion, during which Ravinians dared to wade beyond the dark waters of their home system for the first time, and over 12 millenniums later, thanks in large part to its relative simplicity and low cost, the Abigail has remained the most widely used portable atomic engine in all of Ravinia. When used in the atmosphere, the undampened Abigail, a quite illegal violation, at least in most Ravinian jurisdictions, was known to temporarily deafen the ears those poor souls that had the misfortune of finding themselves anywhere near the fist-sized engine. It was these undampened engines that rattled the flimsy walls of Princess Ryla's refuge. Fortunately for her aides, both Katerna and Lien had the foresight to plug their ears before exiting the safety of the cellar. Plenty a nobleman and lady had the impudence of demonstrating their modified engines during races at Capital in their day. Better days, furniture vibrated across the wooden floor. Books and bottles and other various items were violently shaken from their shelves. A falling redware pot nearly struck Lien's head, shattering harmlessly at her feet instead and fragmenting into 1,000 shards of clay. Yet their hands and fingers could only protect them from so much. Katerna could feel her bones rattling inside her. Lien fell to her knees and vomited. For a moment, she removed a hand from her ear in order to support her weight. She was instantly knocked unconscious by the ferocious sound waves. Her eyes rolled up into her head and blood trickled down from her ear. Katerna held firm. Using her feet, she expertly moved a rug over the cellar. A feeble effort, perhaps, but one that should hold up at a cursory glance. She turned around and placed one defiant foot in front of the other, slowly making her way towards the door, which had long since blown open. She could see it now, a ship of some kind, hovering in midair. The ongoing assault on her senses made its details somewhat difficult to make out. It was rounded in shape and bore smooth, naturalistic curves, a characteristic common to many Ravinian ships. The engines died as the ship continued to descend. The deafening roar turned into a soft purr. Weakened, it was now Katerna's turn to crumple to her knees. Her heart raced and the hue of her frills had changed to a petrified blue. She watched breathlessly as legs extended from the underbelly of the ship. Bits of dust and grass still lingered in the air, slowly fluttering down. Slowly Katerna regained her strength. For the princess. Gods, she might be young and foolish. But Katerna swore an oath. She managed to pull herself to her feet. Virtually, simultaneously, a door slid open and a ramp folded down. Light poured out from the inside of the ship, prompting Katerna to squint. A silhouette walked out, a Ravinian woman, dressed in traditional garb, flanked by her accomplices on both sides. So it was 6 men and 1 woman in total that exited the vehicle, all carrying energy rifles. She noticed the band of Arjman blazon tattooed on their shoulders. These men and women were bounty hunters. Fiercely, Katerna set foot outside of the shanty. Most of the men raised their weapons. The woman, presumably their leader, made a motion with her hand, prompting the rest to lower their weapons. She smiled, evidently quite pleased, and revealed the back of her hand, the same blazon. Katerna et tal, is it? She asked, in that slurry accent common to those living in the periphery. Katerna swallowed. Her eyes narrowed. I'm afraid you have been misled. We are farmers. We possess nothing that your ilk can possibly want. Curious. The woman remarked inquisitively. You have the cadence of a proper capital lady. Now, what could a capital lady possibly be doing in these impoverished backwoods? My mother was a capital lady. Yes. Katerna lied again. In fact, we lived in this very home, quite far separated from the rest of civilization. She taught me to speak in capital style. I laid her to rest just this past year. She entrusted this home in my name, the very home your ship nearly blew away. The woman smirked before holding her arm in front of her face. She tapped a thin band that wrapped around her wrist. A hologram appeared. A white, fuzzy 3-dimensional model of Katerna's head hovered just above the woman's wrist. The woman needn't even look at the hologram. Spare me your lies. Katerna. She motioned upward. The men raised their guns. There's a bounty out for you. 2, as I'm sure you already know, 12 million in coin, dead or alive. Dead, if we also find the lost princess, and thus have no need for you. Alive if we do not uncover her whereabouts, and we believe you may be able to point the way. And the supply of food on my ship is already quite exhausted, so I would much rather not be responsible for feeding an extra mouth. 12 million in coin, and that's for you alone. The other handmaid. The one whose unconscious body I can see laying inside the shanty? 8 million. The lost princess herself? 80 million. That's a lot of money, I'm sure you're well aware, a ludicrous sum if I do say so myself. But that kind of coin can help the band a great deal. New bases, new ships, new weapons, expanded routes. I hope you understand. Katerna shook her head. The princess isn't here. I sent her up north about a month ago, never to return, safer for all of us. Get on the ground. The woman said simply. Katerna hesitated. She obeyed, slowly getting to her knees. The woman crouched down to her level. She revealed a dagger, curved and sharp, and held the blade to Katerna's neck. "You see. I don't believe you." She finally relinquished her grip. She stood up again and began pacing about. "I've been tracking you down for a long while. I've spoken with hundreds of men and women out there, some useful, others not so much. But in all these months, perhaps the most useful information came from a simple shopkeeper living in that pathetic hamlet just north of here. He told of a woman from a shanty out in the woods appearing once a week to purchase various goods, far too many goods for any one woman. And despite holding no job in the village, she seemed to have access to a seemingly infinite reservoir of coin. That snake, the woman stooped to Katerna's level. Her blade hovered just inches above the aide's face. "Now tell me, Katerna et Tal. Where's the lost princess?" No response. The woman swiped with the knife. A large cut opened on Katerna's cheek. It took all the effort she could muster to not break down then and there. "Tell me where." Another cut along the other cheek, this one precariously close to her frill. The woman scoffed and stood up. "I'll be honest, Katerna. A woman of your profession? I didn't think you had it in you." She motioned to her accomplices. "Search the premises. Inspect every inch. We will tear this building apart, piece by piece, if we have to." The men proceeded and brushed past Katerna with frightening swiftness. Her eyes remained fixed on the ground. Deep inside, for the first time in a very long while, she hoped for a miracle. Underneath the creaky floorboards of the house, David and the most youthful of his alien captors faced the stairway with trepidation in a hushed silence. A mysterious planet, a household of scantily clad alien captors, the oddest attempt at interrogation that he had witnessed in all his 30 years, and an oddly intimate administration of emergency medical care. An odd series of events, no doubt, yet now he felt more lucid than he had since his unplanned arrival to this world. David listened. Footsteps shuffled around the floor above, a lot of them. He looked up. He could make out shadows and figures passing between the narrow gaps that separated the planks. Truthfully, he had no business involving himself in any of this. The women, his captors, had appeared to be hiding from something or someone. That much was plainly evident. He'd skimmed through the first contact manual during his time training. Nowhere did it advise becoming involved in local politics or the personal affairs of alien individuals, especially when one cannot speak a word of the local language. Yet one look at the trembling alien girl told him all he needed to know. There were right things and there were wrong things, and this present situation seemed far from righteous. And David knew he had to act. With little hesitation, David, sitting upright on the table, began to untie his lower half. The alien girl turned to face him. Her frills had turned a deep yellow. He wasn't quite sure as to what that meant, but it certainly couldn't be good. She stepped away from the table, allowing him to get to the floor. Standing felt good. His chest still hurt, but whatever the alien had applied earlier helped to soothe the pain a great deal. Now what? His eyes moved across the room, searching for something he could use. There, a drawer. He moved to the drawer and pulled it open. Two-pronged forks, an oddly ergonomic spoon, and something far stranger. Knives. But only the hilts. He delicately held the object and examined it. There was something even stranger affixed to the hilt, a sensor. He placed his thumb on the sensor and a stainless blade flipped out. A soft, blue glow enveloped the cutting edge of the blade. He could feel heat emanating from the glowing region, an odd sight in a place like this. If such tech were to be employed to this extent in this rundown, out-of-the-way cellar, who was to say the cities and metropolises of this world didn't possess even more advanced technology? Perhaps their technological level was equal, or even greater than that of humanities or any other species. A memory popped into his mind, the faint recollection of something he'd read back in the academy. A race of green-skinned alien warriors that shut themselves away from the rest of the galaxy, but now was not the time for recalling lessons from history class. The noisy rummaging and shouts from the room above had only grown louder, and he could hear something fumbling with a metal latch. David gripped the heated knife and turned to the stairway. The cellar door was almost open. He forcibly backed the alien girl and himself into the corner of the room. From there, they could see any intruder walk down the stairs, while the intruder would remain unaware of their presence. He could feel the girl's chest heaving up and down against his arm. She seemed on the verge of hyperventilating. He placed a hand over her mouth and kept his eyes on the stairs. Bam! He heard the cellar door fly open. A pair of bare feet started cautiously down the stairs. It soon became clear that the intruder was male. His shoulders were more broad and he stood taller than any of his captors, almost equal in height to him. It wore no bra and its loincloth covered its entire waist. A necklace jostled up and down above his chest as he descended down the steps. Between his arms he carried the strangest gun David had ever seen, an energy weapon, no doubt, in a shape that closely resembled a squid. The intruder turned around and he and David locked eyes for a moment. A look of confusion and terror crossed the alien's face. David charged the man with the knife. Its blade sunk into the breastplate of the alien. David's hand became a blur, stab after stab after stab. The weapon loosed from the intruder's grasp and clattered to the floor, followed by the intruder himself shortly after. David didn't even have time to grab the alien's gun. Another intruder barreled down the stairs, slamming David into the wall and forcing the knife from his hand. David broke free of his grasp and punched the alien, effectively bashing his head against the wall. The wood was cracked where the alien's head impacted. David forced the alien towards the table and, with a mighty thrust, slammed the intruder's head against the corner. The rest of the table jumped off the ground before falling back down. David let his second victim slump to the floor. He took one glance at the alien girl. She watched in a mix of awe and fear. She'd probably never seen anything like this in her life. Frankly, neither had he. Another pair of footsteps running down the stairs drew his attention. Quickly, he grabbed the alien gun from his first victim. He searched for a trigger, but there was none, only a sensor, like the one on the knife. He placed his finger on the sensor and a bolt of energy exploded from the wide barrel. A hole opened in the third alien's stomach before he too fell to the floor, only his momentum carrying him forward. David released a breath. He looked at the weapon. It must have been a shotgun of some kind. He continued to carry the gun as he stepped over the bodies of his victims. His side throbbed with pain, but he couldn't be bothered now. He slowly walked up the stairs, aiming down the holographic sight of the alien gun. Choreographed tactics weren't doing anyone any good today. He charged up the stairs. 3 aliens with their guns drawn waited for him. He exploded from the cellar and fired at the first alien he saw, a shot to the head, blasting away a great deal of the alien's face and killing him instantly. The second alien fired 3 times, but missed, instead punching holes through the shack's wooden panels and blasting a cabinet to shards. David fired 3 shots in quick succession as he sought cover behind a fallen table, though only one struck the alien. David heard his 5th victim crumple to the floor, followed by the running footsteps of the third shooter. On cue, David spun around and fired, blasting apart the runner's back. Blood now coated the interior of the shack. David poured over the room. No more shooters, at least so it appeared. He noticed the alien girl that first saw him before darting back up the stairs. She was lying on the ground and her ears were bloody. He put a finger to her throat, a heartbeat. She was simply unconscious. A shout came from outside, pure fury dashed with panic. He lifted the gun and stepped outside. Bam! A bolt of energy sailed by harmlessly, blowing apart a section of the doorframe. There were 2 women before him, the one that had tried to question him and gave him water, and someone else. The stranger held his captor in a standing chokehold and pressed a gun to the side of her head. Mari T. Tuck, Bemra Fal Sal. David had no clue as to what the woman was saying. He kept his sights trained on the woman with the gun. Behind was a ship that hovered slightly off the ground, shaped quite like a roach. Mar et tuck, Bemra Fal Sal. She yelled again. David's eyes went to his captors. No words were spoken, but he understood exactly what she meant. Let her go. David yelled uselessly, turning his attention back to the woman. Bemra Fal Sal. She yelled again. Suddenly, his captor sharply elbowed the woman in the stomach. The woman lost control briefly, allowing her to break free. David thumbed the sensor, blowing the woman's side open and causing her handgun to go flying. The woman fell back to the ground, positively dead. David lowered his weapon. His captor looked on in astonishment. She rushed back to the shanty, where the younger girl had since emerged from the cellar. David looked on as they reunited and went to help the unconscious woman. The youngest turned to meet David's gaze, wonder, respect, a hint of dread, and an overwhelming sense of gratefulness. She bowed her head, and David was compelled to do the same. A flood of emotions rushed through David's head. Satisfaction, tiredness, care. But there was one thought that dominated above all others: now what? The Lost Princess, Chapter 6. The following days were oddly normal, at least, as normal as these improbable circumstances could allow. It took about a day for Ryla and her aides to tidy up the house, or whatever was left of it. While the floors were swept of debris and the shelves were restocked, no attempts were made to repair the wooden panels or floorboards that suffered damage during the scuffle. Instead, dressers and drawers were shuffled about and blankets were hung to cover these spots. These meager confines were only ever intended to act as a temporary refuge, at least while Katerna searched for a more permanent and secure home for Princess Ryla. Ryla herself was no slouch. Long had the lost princess grown weary of watching her aides slave tirelessly for her sole benefit, yet while she offered to lend a hand in typical household duties, Katerna would often flatly refuse. After all, menial labor should never be the duty of a princess. This time, however, Katerna loosened some. Ryla assisted Lien in cleaning the walls and furniture of blood and tissue. A nauseating task, no doubt, especially for Lien, who had often approached matters involving bodily fluids with a default sense of queasiness, but deep down, Ryla was grateful. David also played a useful role in completing the more physical tasks that required action. He, with the help of Katerna, carted the bodies of the bounty hunters to a pasture south of their hideout. There, Katerna assembled a small tent-like structure, upon which the two dragged the bodies inside before setting the assemblage ablaze. A traditional Ravinian burial, a birthright, even if apparently undeserved. David could not understand a word Katerna spoke, yet he understood the practice entirely. David's communication skills also improved some. He could not possibly understand a word of what the women said, but he did manage to invent a primitive language of common gestures. Nodding up and down meant yes, a concept common to virtually every intelligent species humanity had yet come into contact with. Interestingly enough, shaking from side to side meant no, a cocked head and a flattened, rotating hand indicated maybe, that sort of thing. More advanced concepts, such as nouns and verbs, were trickier to pantomime. Walking, David quickly realized, could only be indicated by walking in place, much to the amusement of the ladies. The act of shoveling could only be demonstrated by pretending to shovel at the ground with an invisible shovel, and eating could only be shown by cupping his hand near his mouth and pretending to chew, but in most cases, the object in question would be located within pointing distance. The sort of language described above was only necessary when such objects were not in view, or he was trying to convey a more abstract concept. The girls' relationships with David began to evolve as well. It was Katerna that spent the most time with him, usually while performing physical labor of some kind. Her icy demeanor, gradually, very, very gradually, began to melt away, even if only a bit. Once Ryla spotted her laughing with him while skinning the household's dinner for the night. At another time, she caught her staring at him, the coldness gone, replaced instead with longing. Ryla herself felt a sort of draw towards David. Her duty regarding him, and Lien's, to a slightly lesser extent, was to determine what he could and couldn't eat. As it turned out, the alien must have had a gut of steel, as David could eat virtually anything they could throw at him, not that they had a whole lot, in all truthfulness. Once David drank a half bottle of Gemiorg milk, stepped outside and nearly vomited, before quickly returning and downing the rest. Ryla could hardly breathe between her fits of laughter, while Lien nearly fainted at the sight. Ryla was also in charge of attending to David's wounds. She periodically cleaned that terrible gash and reapplied the ointment at regular intervals. Without proper supplies, she was also forced to cut up a curtain to use as makeshift bandages, which she replaced when necessary. The healing solution didn't appear to be as potent in speeding up the mending process in David as it was in Ravinians, but within several days, the gash had disappeared entirely and the need for a constant bandage vanished with it. On occasion, she would catch his eyes lingering on her, almost as if her simple being was wholly entrancing. It was these times where he seemed softer, more vulnerable. A far cry from the alien that shot his way through a gang of Arjman bounty hunters, with blistering speed and startling efficiency. She found herself reminiscing about that night whenever she took a seat at the dining table or emerged from the cellar, half expecting the bruised and battered alien to be standing over dismembered bounty hunters, or perhaps royal guards. A switch flipped in him that night. She knew from the moment they locked eyes during the scuffle in the cellar that something had changed. She knew, perhaps against all logic and reason, that this brute of an alien would never let so much as an ounce of harm come to her or her aides. The shanty's accommodations became even more restricted, given the damage dealt to the house. Despite the hot and humid days, at nights, a vicious cold spell tended to descend upon the valley, rendering the main floor uninhabitable during the late hours of the evening. All 4 members were forced to sleep within the cramped confines of the cellar, which itself was only a marginal improvement in regards to warmth. This setup couldn't last, and David knew that. Quietly, at the twilight hour of his 11th day on this world, David renewed his resolve to find a way off this world. These women were in dire straits as it was, his arrival only placed an undue burden on their shoulders. And besides, there was still a war being waged. Naturally, the contribution of any single man could only be so great, yet he struggled with the idea of living in relative peace while tens of thousands of human lives were lost every hour. There was a faint voice, egging him from the deepest recesses of his mind, begging him to stay, but he tried his damnedest to ignore it. He had taken time to examine the roach-shaped ship that the bounty hunters had left behind, the one that Katerna had expertly maneuvered under a canopy of trees. He had pored over the controls quite closely and figured he could pilot it manually, though he'd much rather not, but before he could do anything, he needed to be able to communicate properly, and in order to do that, he needed GAIA. But before he could do that, he wanted Katerna's permission. So during the morning of the following day, David asked if he could accompany her on a hunt, to which she quietly obliged. It was an elk they were after. Or at least, it had all the telltale signs of being an elk. Katerna had been helpful enough to draw an illustration of their prey on her tablet. Yes, her tablet, the natives of this world and their relationship with technology never ceased to amaze David. Once, he spotted Leanne control a hovering drone that spotted and plucked spices from the ground. According to the impressive sketch, the animal possessed 4 legs, 2 antlers, hooves, and a small tuft of a tail. It even had the basic shape of an elk. The only apparent differences between this creature and any typical elk one may come across while traversing the great forests of the Pacific Northwest were its white and black spotted fur and an egregiously long neck. Its hooves also appeared to be somewhat oversized, so it was when David spotted a large, cloven hoofprint in a patch of mud that he knew they were on the trail of the beast. Katerna examined the print with stun and surprise. In all her trips into these woods for game, not once had she spotted an elusive shermark. She had seen its meat in Darnan, so she knew it inhabited this region, but never had she seen one with her own eyes, or even a hoofprint, for that matter. She watched the alien closely as he searched for more tracks. She was certain he was a soldier now. The princess had expressed this notion to her in private, and as time passed, all doubts that alluded to anything of the contrary had evaporated. He was exceptionally fit, managed to take down all 7 of the Arjman hunters with brutal ease, and wielded their alien weapons with apparent ease. She marveled at how quickly he managed to master the light bow, an incarnation of an ancient weapon that dealt in energy bolts rather than sticks and sharpened rocks. The alien seemed particularly impressed by its range and accuracy, for good reason, too. The light bow was the centerpiece of any warrior's arsenal. After some time, the alien pointed to a spot on the ground. Tracks. Wordlessly, the 2 began to stalk the path the shermark had walked not long ago. Katerna took the lead now. Her frills shifted purple as her nose searched for the beast's scent. She made sure not to disturb the tracks and tread lightly in her bare feet across the forest floor. The alien, for whatever odd reason, seemed to insist on wearing the rubber cloth garment that covered its feet. He plodded and crunched through leaves and sticks and mud. After a while, she made a crude gesture indicating that he should quiet his steps, which he silently agreed to do. On a tangential note, the alien's wardrobe was quite odd in a number of other ways. Not once, aside from a religious marriage on some far-flung moon during her youth, had she ever seen a creature so clothed, but perhaps it was better that way. Once, she made the princess in charge of scrubbing and cleaning their everyday wear. She made a point to wash the alien's shirt, which had since gone unwashed since Katerna and Leanne carted his limp body to their refuge. The alien promptly removed his shirt, revealing the most defined chest any of the women had seen. The alien seemed relatively unbothered, but Ryla struggled to speak in anything but giggles when referring to the alien that night, and Leanne vanished into the forest for a period of several hours before emerging. More contented and placid than she had been in months, Katerna's frills briefly turned crimson at the thought. She caught herself, drawing in a breath and refocusing on the task at hand. Ah, yes, the scent of the shrimmark, it was growing stronger, there it was. Beyond a bush in a narrow opening, the beast grazed at a lonely tree. Its long neck enabled the animal to eat leaves from trees. It was bigger than she imagined, its carcass would surely provide generous meals for a week. She had initially suggested the shrimmark to be their priority target to the alien, if only to see if anything would come of it. Now here it was, not 20 paces before them. She grasped her light bow and aimed it directly at the animal's head. Better to make this quick and painless. A prolonged hunt for this injured and angry beast was the last thing she wanted. She glanced at the alien who sat crouched, carefully observing the shrimmark. She motioned upwards, and he too drew his light bow. She released a breath. She sent a bolt of pure energy flying into the beast's head. The follow-up shot by the alien in the same region killed the beast, causing it to fall over. A clean kill. She looked to the alien and smiled warmly. He did the same. It was the alien that hauled the beast back to the shanty. He carried it the whole way, without quarrel or argument. Quietly, Ryla's eldest aide had contemplated the future of their present arrangement with this alien. He had made a great help in certain tasks that needed doing in and around the shanty. He had proven more than capable of defending the princess and herself. And somehow, despite the attempt on her life not longer than a week ago, every morning seemed a bit more warm and sunny, so when the alien indicated that he would like to travel back to the wreckage of his ship, Katerna couldn't help but nod in assent. Even if the sky became a bit more gray, what she did not expect was for Princess Ryla to ask to go with him. The Lost Princess, Chapter 7. Perhaps ask wasn't the proper term, although the words that came from Princess Ryla's mouth made the declarative statement sound very much like a question indeed. Even Ryla recognized this. Out of courtesy, Katerna waited until the alien was out of earshot, although he would not understand a single word being spoken, before gripping the princess' arm and pulling her towards the water well. Ryla stared daggers at her. If looks could kill, her poor aide would have been reduced to ashes then and there. Princess. What could you possibly be suggesting? Did I not speak clearly enough for you? Ryla said with sudden savageness. I intend to accompany the alien during his trip back to the remains of his ship. Katerna scoffed. How did you hear of this? The man himself communicated his goal to me just a minute ago. The poor man can only speak through gestures, motions that can be spotted from a half-mile away. She explained. Her voice became quieter. No conversation between him and anyone can truly be private. Katerna was quiet for a moment. She looked upon her junior with heavy eyes. Princess, your tone worries me. Truthfully, Ryla had no clue as to what triggered her brash, sour demeanor. Was it envy? Possibly. Of the shanty's 3 Ravinian inhabitants, it was Katerna that spent the most time with the alien. It made sense. After all, Katerna's set of duties were more attuned to his physical skill set. It only made sense that Katerna would derive the most use from the alien's company. But there was something more than that, something deeper. Ryla and Katerna had never explicitly shared words on the matter. Such talks seemed rather unbecoming, but Ryla knew exactly what Katerna saw in him, because she very much saw it too. Or perhaps it was anger. But this too was irrational, after all, as there was no need for anger. Katerna had been gracious during the preceding days in assigning tasks to Ryla, allowing her to feel as like she were truly contributing to their cause. Katerna produced meals each day, and she was the one who stood up for the princess against those vicious bounty hunters, all while she cowered down in the cellar, petrified with fear, and now Ryla was more confused than ever. But she had dug herself into this conversation, and she intended to dig herself out, yet she found herself unable to speak. She stood there, dumbly, waiting for an answer to a question she never asked. Katerna chewed on her lip. Something was working inside her mind. As to what, her aide provided no clues. So you come to me, announcing your intention to accompany the alien on his adventure back to the remains of his ship, and you expect me to grant you permission that you never needed? Ryla remained silent, quite a conundrum. Katerna muttered absently. The princess nearly turned around and started away, now desperate to exit this conversation, but Katerna continued, as your sworn aide, I have, over the years, put up with a great deal from you. You are young, and you are foolish, and I often request that you mind your ways. But you are not some ordinary girl, you are the princess of Ravinia. I understand that our seclusion here has understandably eroded our ability to communicate, especially with those beyond our small sphere here, But a princess is expected to speak with a degree of cadence and authority that you have not yet been able to communicate properly. You attempt to assert yourself by the crudest of means. You approached me with agitation and bitterness when you never had to approach me at all. And do note, Princess Ryla, that my sworn and undying loyalty to you is far from default. From most, you must be able to earn and command respect, even those under you. Such a skill will be especially important going forward, given our current status. Ryla, you are the damn princess of Ravinia. I expect you to act like it. And with those words, Caterna turned and started away, towards the game she and the alien had caught. Ryla, again, found herself at an absolute loss for words. What in the world was that? Dumbfounded, but perhaps a bit enlightened, Princess Ryla started for the woods, her mind cloudier than ever. It was around noon of the following day when Alien and Ryla departed for the wreckage of the former spacecraft. Caterna deliberated, going with them, for some time. Truthfully, in the aide's eyes, it was a simple matter of risk and reward. The rewards, of course, being the ripening of Ryla's newfound convictions and a taste of freedom, the sort that laid beyond the shanty's flimsy walls and, to an arguably greater extent, also laid beyond the walls of the royal palace where she had dwelled for much of her life, long before the usurper seized the throne. The risk involved, of course, being the exposure that was a natural consequence of such freedom. The alien did not pose a threat to the princess. It took Caterna a great deal of silent rumination to come to this conclusion, but now it was an undeniable fact. The alien meant no harm, at least to them. But bounty hunters did. They had even managed to track down their location. Had the alien not been there, Caterna would likely be spending these hours in a steely prison cell, awaiting her imminent execution, while the princess would be forced to marry that villainous, treasonous, hard-faced. More apt terms escaped Caterna at the moment. She laid flat behind a thicket, her keen eyes scanning the trail for passers-by. Frankly, this was the true reason for her apparent absence. One crucial detail had remained with her since their encounter with the bounty hunters, the mention of a shopkeeper that divulged the whereabouts of Caterna, and therefore the princess. Haber Salim was his name. A round and plump individual that tended to a produce store in the village of Darnan. Caterna made long and regular trips to the lowly riverside hamlet every week. She had, on several occasions, bought produce from Haber. Somehow, she wasn't quite sure as to how, he managed to learn the location of the royal exiles. She had made a trip to Darnan earlier in the week, but the shopkeeper was nowhere to be seen, seemingly replaced by his younger assistant. The boy insisted that Haber would return by the end of the week. Now, the end of the week had arrived, and Caterna stalked the side of the only road in and out of Darnan. Her gaze fell upon a clump of displaced dirt in the middle of the road. Beneath the disheveled soil was an explosive landmine, a small little thing she had found inside the bounty hunter's ship. She found only two, the first of which she detonated in a clearing about 7 miles east of her present position. The resulting explosion was far larger than she had anticipated. She had no doubt that the explosion would kill Haber. The real question was if there would be anything left. Kill Haber. It seemed so simple, so straightforward. A year ago, she would have been disgusted by the very thought. But now, her face hardened. Circumstances have changed. That man's words very nearly resulted her in death. Still, doubt gnawed at her. More time passed. She resisted the urge to scratch at her face. Pale, discolored scars now existed where the bounty hunter had slashed her cheeks, barely noticeable from a distance, but quite visible when up close. Luckily, Ryla possessed the medical knowledge and equipment to heal her wounds quickly, but the pain still hadn't fully subsided. The days of passive sleep were gone. Tossing and turning and fidgeting about would leave her with a painful reminder of that dreadful night, a rumbling, distant and far away. Caterna immediately became more alert. She picked up the remote trigger to the landmine, a vehicle. It slowly rounded a distant bend, coming fully into view. It hovered above the trail, sticking quite low to the ground. Caterna, fully hidden out of sight, thumbed the detonator. The vehicle's engines made an annoying, guttural sound as the hovercraft spat and sputtered its way along the trail. Closer. Closer. Now, there was a soft click as she pressed the detonator. Nothing. The battered vehicle idly hovered past Caterna. She gleamed Haber for a split second, sitting contently at the dash, half asleep as the vehicle drove him to the village. The vehicle disappeared behind a cluster of trees not long after. A wave of pure, unfettered hatred washed over Katerina, followed by deep sense of relief. Confused and conflicted, she screamed at the sky, at the world, at everything. She collapsed and laid there, a heated mess. Oh gods. Yet Ryla looked to her for advice. The sun had crossed the apex of the sky, and now was quite far along the path of its descent behind a range of distant mountains. The sky was a pinkish-orange color, and shadows became increasingly elongated. After more walking than he had anticipated, the wreckage of David's ship was finally in sight. He started down a golden hill with renewed eagerness, and the alien girl trailed him closely. He had been here before, when he first landed. It seemed quite long ago now, despite the fact that, in reality, just over a week and a half had passed. He peered into the sky. The first star of the night had slowly faded into view over the past half hour, or perhaps it was a planet. Whatever the case, it was now clearly visible. A somber reminder of the sheer depths of space. It all seemed so far away now. He had tried tuning the communications array housed within the bounty hunter's ship to the frequency used by humanity and its allies. There was absolutely nothing, not even the calming roar of interstellar static. Yet, not since that girl came down and tended to his wounds had he felt alone. His captors, despite their initial apprehensions and misgivings, which, as he saw, were entirely warranted, had since come to treat him amicably, perhaps even as an equal. His gaze went to the alien girl that had decided to accompany him. The youngest of three, apparently, but also the most distinct. She was vivacious and eager in the presence of the other two, but took a more distant and taciturn demeanor when near him. They hadn't communicated much during their afternoon journey. As it turned out, gesticulating while walking was a rather difficult task. He prized the moments where he managed to squeeze an infectious laugh or a sunny giggle from the girl. He caught himself staring at her absent-mindedly more than he cared to admit. She was utterly gorgeous, and in this light of a setting sun, her splendor was amplified by an order of magnitude. Light glistened off her moist, bare legs as she tread down the hill with unrivaled grace and elegance. Her gait was light and cautious, as though she too were a stranger to these rolling hills and simmering forests. Perhaps she was. There was an aura about her, a sort of gravity that he couldn't help but fall victim to from time to time, and sometimes, it seemed like she looked at him with those same eyes. Quizzical, cautious, atop a foundation of insatiable hunger. Fuck. She was looking at him now. It had happened again. He turned away and back towards the wreckage of the ship, which grew closer with every step. There was something she was hiding behind those dark eyes, or perhaps he simply couldn't understand. She and her companions were in a predicament. Something was eating at her, destroying her from the inside. As to what exactly, David didn't fully understand. But in order to arrange his return to the human dominion, David needed to know, and the best way to know was through proper communication, and other than learning an alien language from scratch, the best way to go about that was having GAIA build a translator. And to do that, he needed to find GAIA, and now they had finally reached the site of the wreckage. The site appeared surprisingly undisturbed. The ship's blackened metal frame was cool now. He tried to retrace his steps around the wreckage. The cockpit, yes, still empty. The alien girl paused before starting to circle the site, examining every inch from afar. David dropped to his knees and combed through the grass. Feeling for the small device, after about a minute of searching, there it was, out of the corner of his eye. Its metal finish caught the light and seemed to shine. It was an earpiece no larger than a fingernail. It showed signs of wear, a light coat of mud and dirt had graced its metal exterior. He showed the device to the girl with a smile. She smiled back, also appearing quite pleased. He pressed the center of the device and it lit up with a soft, blue glow. He fitted the piece inside his ear as GAIA initialized, Commander David Reyes. I thought you would never return. I have a great deal to tell you.